Have you ever pondered on why the Vietnam War started in the first place? To truly understand, we need to travel back in time and delve into the historical context that led to this devastating conflict. Let's begin in the late 19th century, when Vietnam was a part of French Indochina, a colonial empire in Southeast Asia. The French ruled with an iron fist, exploiting the land and people to fuel their own economic ambitions. This reign, however, was not without opposition. Nationalistic movements began to bubble under the surface as Vietnamese citizens yearned for independence and freedom from their colonial oppressors. One such figure who emerged from these movements was Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary leader who would play a pivotal role in Vietnam's quest for liberation. His vision of a free communist Vietnam gained traction among the populace, sowing the seeds of a conflict that would eventually draw in global powers. World War II was a turning point. The Japanese occupation of Vietnam during the war weakened French control, setting the stage for Minh and his Viet Minh forces to rise to prominence. When the war ended, the French sought to reassert their control, but the Vietnamese people had tasted the possibility of independence. The resulting First Indochina War ended with the Geneva Accords in 1954, a resolution that left no party entirely satisfied. Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel into two distinct entities. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, embraced communism, while the South, under President Ngo Dinh Diem, leaned towards the West. This division, however, was intended to be temporary, a mere stepping stone towards nationwide elections that would unify the country. But as Cold War tensions escalated, these elections never took place. The North and South grew further apart, each side backed by global superpowers with their own vested interests in the region. This sets the stage for a conflict that would last for nearly 2 decades. Now, how did this local conflict escalate into an international crisis? This question takes us to the heart of the matter. Let's delve deep into it. It all begins with the growing involvement of the United States in Vietnam. Remember, this was the Cold War era. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, saw Vietnam as a crucial front in their ideological battle, so they decided to step in to support the South Vietnamese government. However, their involvement was initially limited to financial aid and military advisors. The game changer was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964. 2 U.S. destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. While there's been much debate about the veracity of these attacks, the incident gave U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson the ammunition he needed. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution swiftly followed, effectively giving the president the power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. In layman's terms, it was a blank check for war without a formal declaration. In the wake of the resolution, the United States dramatically increased its military presence in Vietnam. From a few thousand advisors in the early 60s, the number of American troops swelled to over 180,000 by the end of 1965. This marked the start of major military operations, with the US initiating a sustained bombing campaign against the North known as Operation Rolling Thunder. This escalation was not without its critics, both at home and abroad. Yet it was a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. What had started as a local conflict, a civil war even, had now become an international battlefield, a stage for the superpowers to flex their military muscles. This escalation transformed a regional conflict into a full-blown war, and as we'll soon see, it was a war unlike any other. What were the pivotal moments when the war was at its peak? Let's dive into that. The Tet Offensive, launched in early 1968, was a series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces against South Vietnam and its allies. Despite initial shock and heavy casualties, the US and South Vietnamese forces managed to repel the offensive. However, the Tet Offensive shattered the US government's optimistic portrayal of the war and eroded public support back home. Meanwhile, the My Lai massacre, occurring in March of the same year, was a grim testament to the horrors of war. US forces, believing the village of My Lai was harboring Viet Cong soldiers, massacred hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. When news of the atrocity reached the US, public outcry was immediate and intense. The massacre further fueled anti-war sentiment and raised serious questions about the conduct of American soldiers. On another front, the US expanded its military operations into Cambodia in 1970. This decision, aimed at destroying Viet Cong bases and supply routes, was met with widespread criticism. The bombing campaign resulted in significant civilian casualties and further destabilized the region, contributing to the rise of the brutal Khmer Rouge regime. The impact of these key events was felt deeply in both American and Vietnamese societies. In America, disillusionment with the war escalated, leading to widespread protests and a growing anti-war movement. The credibility of the US government was severely damaged, and the nation was divided like never before. In Vietnam, the war brought about enormous suffering and loss. The Vietnamese people endured unimaginable hardships, their lives forever marked by the ravages of conflict. Yet they also demonstrated remarkable resilience, determined to fight for their country's independence. These events marked a turning point, leading to widespread disillusionment and protest. The war at its peak was a tumultuous period of escalating conflict and heightened tensions, shaping the course of the Vietnam War and leaving indelible marks on both nations. But how did this long, costly war finally come to an end? In the early 70s, the winds of change began to blow. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, marked a significant step towards ending the conflict. What was initially a war of ideology had turned into a war of attrition, and the world was eager for a resolution. The Accords were a testament to this, promising a ceasefire in place and the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. But peace, it seemed, was still a distant dream. Even as American forces began to withdraw, the fighting between North and South Vietnam continued unabated. The Accords had not resolved the underlying issues, and the war raged on. The final act of the war came in April 1975 with the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. North Vietnamese forces stormed into the city, marking the end of the Republic of Vietnam and the beginning of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The images of the last American helicopter leaving the US Embassy in Saigon, a symbol of the end of American involvement, are still etched in our collective memory. The aftermath of the war was just as dramatic as the war itself. The end of the conflict saw the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The country was left with the formidable task of rebuilding from the ruins of the war. The scars of the conflict ran deep, and the effects were felt far beyond the borders of Vietnam. Internationally, the Vietnam War led to a shift in global politics. It marked a turning point in the Cold War, highlighting the limits of American power and influence. It also sparked a wave of anti-war sentiment and protest movements across the world, forever changing the way we perceive war and conflict. The end of the war left a legacy that still resonates today. The Vietnam War, despite its end, continues to cast a long shadow over global history and politics, reminding us of the cost of conflict and the price of peace. So, what can we learn from the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War, a conflict rooted in political ideologies, escalated into a full-blown war that dominated international relations. It peaked with unforgettable scenes of fierce battles, political turmoil, and the undeniable resilience of the human spirit. The war eventually ended, yet its echoes are still heard today. Lessons from the war are manifold. It taught us about the devastating effects of prolonged conflict on societies, the futility of war as a tool for achieving political ends, and the importance of diplomacy in resolving international disputes. The war also had a profound impact on foreign policy, instigating a more cautious approach towards intervention in foreign conflicts. It highlighted the necessity of understanding cultural and political nuances before engaging in overseas expeditions. The Vietnam War, a complex and controversial part of history, continues to shape our understanding of conflict, power, and human resilience.